on the scripts if you want to instead of you. It's up to you. Yeah.
If y'all want to, y'all can sit right behind. You have to sit down. Maybe uncomfortable, but it's a privilege. So just have a seat if y'all want to sit down. Standing here won't be very good. This is a fire hazard.
Oh, we're past that stage.
We're past that.
Yeah, we went past that stage early.
Ready to begin. I'm John Hilbert, president here in Delta State. We just couldn't be more pleased to see the response to this program. It's a very special opportunity for all of us, and I thank all of you for coming. My task is to introduce Dr. Gary Jennings, who is a professor of political science here at Delta State, who really has been responsible for putting this program together. And I want to pay a little tribute to Gary for what he does year in and year out outside of his work in classrooms. He spends a good bit of time working with high school students, trying to get them ready to enroll in college.
His leadership. In his 1967 essay, The Responsibility of Intellectuals, he wrote a warning to us about the role of the professoriate in addressing the major problems of our time. He wrote the following: "It is the responsibility of intellectuals to speak the truth and to expose lies. This, at least, may seem enough of a truism to pass over without comment. Not so, however. For the modern intellectual, it is not all that obvious. Thus, we have Martin Heidegger writing in a pro-Hitler declaration of 1933 that, quote, 'Truth is the revelation of that which makes a certain people clear and strong in its action and its knowledge.'" Now, let's remember, by the way, that Martin Heidegger, in 1933, assumed the rectorate of the University of Freiburg and then put on the tunic of the Nazi Party. In all of these exhortations that Professor Chomsky has made all of these decades, we owe him a great debt of gratitude for the example, the dedication, and the power of his ideas and his arguments. Now, many of my colleagues have been surprised at the fact that we have Professor Chomsky here. And I can tell you that it took great patience to do this, because in 2003, I started to correspond with Noam. And then in 2005, when Bev was out there trying to keep the NHK of Tokyo from running us over before we finished our meeting, we talked about this also. We talked about a few other things. And we also talked about the work that we do here. And I have to say that although it was extremely generous of Dr. Hilbert to make those remarks about me, thank you very much, Dr. Hilbert, it is also the case that I do all of what I do with the support of my close colleagues in the Division of Social Sciences. Because we reach out, we do both theoretical and applied research, we work with the community, we try and build that small d democracy and support for the people here in the region and beyond. And our students take lessons from that, and certainly I've taken lessons from my colleagues. So I owe my colleagues a great debt of gratitude. Thank you very much. Let me say then that I suppose this is it. And so with great joy and great admiration, thank you very much, Noam, for coming, and let me bring you to the podium.
Is that working? Can you hear me? Yeah? Raise your hand if you can say if you can hear me. Okay, right. I'll do that also. Visual is better. About a year ago, I went to Mexico and gave some talks at the National University there, UNAM. It's a very impressive university. It has several 100,000 students, impressive campus, very high quality, met a lot of faculty members, very good faculty, lively student body. My impressions were, of course, brief, but my son-in-law who teaches there confirms that that's the way it is. It's also free. About 10 years ago, the government made a slight effort to add a very low tuition, but there was a student strike at the university and all over the country, in fact, and the government backed down. Actually, students are still occupying one building, which is a kind of an action center for all sorts of activities. Well, that's Mexico, fairly poor country. From there, I went directly to the Bay Area in California, maybe one of the richest places in the world, where they're in the process of systematically dismantling what has been the greatest public education system in the world. The major universities, Berkeley and UCLA, maybe San Diego, are on the verge of being privatized. Tuition is extremely high, almost as high as the big private universities. They have corporate donors, big endowments, essentially on the verge of being privatized, which will happen pretty soon. The rest of the really great university system, which has many levels, state colleges and so on, is being reduced to mostly technical training for the non-privileged, non-elite part of the population. Next year, for the first time, the funding for the university from tuition is going to surpass funding from the state. It's the whole university system. Actually, that's happening across the country. By now, a majority of states, tuition covers more than half of the college budget, as tuitions are shooting up and state support is going down. That's also true of most of the public universities, public research universities, the major ones. The comparison with Mexico rather strongly suggests that this is not an economic necessity. Mexico is far poorer than the United States, and there's more evidence for that. Pretty soon, the way things are going, only community colleges will be state financed, and even they are under attack. I'll quote a leading educational authority who writes that the era of affordable four-year public universities, heavily subsidized by the state, it may be over. Now, of course, he's talking about the United States. It's a unique phenomenon in the United States, although England, under the current right-wing government, is beginning in the last few months to make moves in the same direction, which has led to huge student strikes all over the country, demonstrations, as you've probably seen. Well, it's useful to recall that the great growth period in the American economy, the highest ever, was in the several decades after World War II. That was very substantially fueled by cheap, in fact, free public education. and by university research. And that includes the GI Bill, which provided free education for veterans, huge number of young men at that time, most of whom would never have gone to college. There was also extremely low tuition at private colleges. And as for research, that's the core of the modern high-tech economy. Computers, internet, IT revolution, much else. It all grew, most of it grew out of the research universities of the 1940s and the 1950s, 1960s. In fact, most of these were in the public sector. Were in the public sector for decades. The first digital computers began to be available in the early 50s, but they were way too big and complex and slow and expensive. Nobody could buy them. They actually went onto the market around 1980, years later. Internet was in the public sector for about 35 years. These changes that are taking place now with regard to the universities are part of a much broader phenomenon. They're among the many moves towards a radically two-tiered society with a very small sector of extreme wealth and the lowering of all the rest. I'll return to the specific consequences for education, public school education too. But it's important to recognize that what's going on with the educational system is a very systematic, planned part of a much more general process. It's going on essentially for the last 30 years. During the last 30 years, state policy, more and more closely linked to corporate sector, has been geared to the welfare of extreme wealth. So we have a welfare state, but geared to extreme wealth. Inequality, as you probably know, has reached historic heights in the United States. But what isn't recognized often is that it's a new kind of inequality. The top 1% is super rich. That's where most of the inequality is coming from. And in fact, even that's not true, because the top 1/10 of 1%, if you look, the curve is very sharply skewed at the high end. That means predominantly CEOs, top managers, hedge fund managers, people like that. Tax cuts are very carefully crafted to benefit the super rich. So if you take, say, the Bush tax cut in 2001, which right now is a very heavy, actually it's worse than a tax increase, because the freeze, remember, it goes over an extended period, and that means it keeps lowering pay because of inflation, population growth, and so on. So there's a substantial tax increase for federal workers taking place at the same time that there's a sharp tax decrease for the very rich, which is sharply increasing the federal deficit. And all of this was carried off very impressively. You look at the commentary in the press and so on, mostly praise for Obama's statesmanship and bipartisanship and the country's back on the right road again. That's impressive. There was also a payroll tax decrease, payroll tax for Social Security, that was decreased. Well, that sounds good, you know, it gives people a little more money in their pockets, but it's a Trojan horse. Just take a look at the way it was designed. It was designed to be a sunset technique. The payroll tax decrease is for 2 years. What's happening in 2 years? Well, in 2 years, there's going to be an election coming up. And the people who crafted it understand that in an election year, almost nobody's going to say, let's raise Social Security taxes, meaning bring them back to what they were. So in effect, that is a permanent tax decrease. And that's important. Contrary to what you read, Social Security is in quite good financial shape for decades, and a little tweaking will let it go on forever. Furthermore, contrary to what you read all the time, it does nothing to the deficit. Social Security doesn't add to the deficit, lives off the payroll taxes. It's also extremely efficiently administered, with almost no administrative costs. But it's there's great effort being made right now to destroy it. In fact, there has been for years, but it has such enormous public support that it's been very hard to eliminate. Elimination means privatizing. Well, one of the ways, there's a standard way to proceed if you want to privatize something, like public schools, for example. If you're trying to privatize the public schools, the technique is defund them. And then when they don't work, and people get upset about them because they're not working, you say, well, we've got to privatize them. Now, that's routine. When Margaret Thatcher in England wanted to destroy the reasonably efficient railroad system to privatize it, what she did was defund it, stopped working, trains were late, people got upset, then you could privatize it. Actually, it turned out that privatizing it was such a disaster that they had to nationalize it again at great cost. But anyway, that's the technique. It's common, and it's being used right now for Social Security. Well, why is there such an intense effort to destroy Social Security? A very efficient program, costs almost nothing, little administration. It keeps elderly people off. I mean, it's greatly increased the welfare of the elderly population. It doesn't pay them much, but it pays them enough to survive. And it's extremely popular. Well, one reason is that these Social Security funds, as long as they're held efficiently in government hands, are of no use whatsoever to financial institutions, to banks and investment firms and so on. If they're privatized, those funds go to Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup, and they can play all kinds of games with them, and they got their hands on trillions of dollars on which they can make all sorts of profit, and when it tanks, public will pay for it. That's the way the game is played. So there's a very strong reason to privatize, meaning eliminate Social Security. But there's even a deeper reason. The Social Security is based on a principle which is considered, really subversive. It's based on the principle that people should care about each other, that you should care whether the widow across town is starving, let's say. And that's no good. You have to have it drilled into your head that the only thing you're interested in is your own personal welfare, period. Concern for anyone else is a major sin. Sin. So that has to, and this sense of solidarity that comes out of that is the basis of things like social security and public schools, for that matter. That has to be eliminated if you're going to have what's sometimes called a winner-take-all society, small sector of extreme wealth, with the rest making out somehow the best they can. Well, all of this is one part of really.
The erosion of that, is that a product more of the economy changing from industrial-based to a service-based and lower wage jobs that just can't sustain a blue-collar middle class?
Is it due to the erosion of the industrial base? Actually, if you look, the industrial base hasn't eroded. It's been shifted. In New England, where I live, which was the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, after a while it shifted. So the industrial towns in New England are collapsing, but that's because production went to the south, or the west. And they went because the owners and managers could make more profit that way, not for the workforce. In fact, if you really look carefully, there was offshoring to China back in the early 19th century, very small scale. Now, banks, owners, Jeffrey Immelt, head of GE and so on, they can make more money by shifting production to China or to Mexico or to Vietnam. The industrial base is still there, they're just moving. Now there's a real question why they should have the right to decide. I mean, what law of nature is it that says that the owners and managers of an industry should have a right to decide where production takes place? And why shouldn't the workforce and the community have the right to decide? Well, that again is a social decision. It's not a, it's not a law of nature. And if you look back at, and sometimes it's quite striking how it happens. Like right now, near where I live, small town here, near Boston, Taunton, Mass, there is a multinational that's closing down a fairly successful, profitable plant, which makes sealants for airplane planes, things like that. And they're doing okay, but they're not making the kind of profit that a multinational wants. You know, they're financial, and they're bankers and bosses and so on want huge profits. Now these are just making decent profits. So they're closing it down. The union and the community are offering to buy the plant. The multinationals refusing. They would rather lose money than have a worker community-owned plant that would be successful and would be a model for others. They are, the business classes are basically vulgar Marxists. They're fighting class war, and they do not want to permit the understanding that it's possible to have a different world. So they're happy to lose money rather than to allow this to proceed. Well, you know, with enough public support and government support, it could succeed. Actually, it's come pretty close a couple times. Back around 30 years ago, I guess, the U.S. Steel wanted to close its main plants in Youngstown, Ohio. Which, remember, you close a plant, you're destroying the community. Most of these communities are built by, developed out of industrial installations and so on. So they wanted to close down their plants in Youngstown and move them somewhere else, I forget where. And there was a very substantial effort on the part of the labor movement, churches, community organizations, and so on, to get them to allow the stakeholders, workforce and community, to buy the plant and keep it operating. For the same reasons, the U.S. still didn't want to do it. It was finally taken to the courts. Stoughton Lynn was a labor activist, civil rights activist. He was a lawyer for them. They went to the courts, and actually they lost in the courts. But if they'd had enough public support, they would have won. And that would be different. But incidentally, these are not exotic ideas. If you go back to the 19th century, the U.S. had a pretty militant labor movement. Big labor movement. There was a lot of violent repression, but they were very active. They had their own press, for example. And that was the period of the freest press in the United States. All sorts of press, locally run, ethnic groups, labor groups, others, and a lot of involvement, a lot of interest, very widely read. The labor press is really interesting to read. It was written by workers in this is eastern New England now, origins of the Industrial Revolution. People in the factories and Irish artisans from Boston, young women from the farms, called factory girls. They ran their own press. That's extremely interesting. They bitterly condemned what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self. Sound familiar? They said that's degrading. It's taking away their rights, their culture, their individuality. They're essentially slaves to a new kind of monarchy. They believed that their slogan was that those who work in the mills should own them. That was a standard of the labor movement, even its conservative elements. And in fact, at that time, mid-19th century, it was very widely believed in the United States that wage labor is not very different from slavery. Its only difference is that it's temporary. But they're both forms of coerced labor. And we're free people. We should have the right to control our own labor. Abraham Lincoln believed that. In fact, that was actually a slogan of the Republican Party back in the mid-19th century. It's taken a lot of effort to beat these ideas out of people's heads. I don't think they're very far below the surface. They keep coming up when circumstances arise. So I think there really are alternatives, and they can be chosen, especially in a country like this, which is, with all of its flaws, is a very free country in many ways. Government has very limited capacity to coerce as compared with other countries. And there's a lot of things have been won, even in recent years. A lot of freedom's been won. So there's a there's opportunities to grasp them.